Okay, well, hello everyone. How are you today? Oh, good. Could I answer any questions for anyone before we get started today? Doing all right, huh? All right, fantastic. Did everybody see the next lab is posted? I think I might have mentioned that last time, but just in case. Never hurts to point that out again, I suppose. Right? So, no questions. When we finished up on last time, whatever day that was, Tuesday, when we finished up last Tuesday, we had gotten through most of the basics of working our way through active record model objects. We basically can create them in a variety of different ways. We can update them in a variety of different ways. We can retrieve them in a variety of different ways. And we saw how we can destroy, not in a variety of different ways. Basically just one way to destroy. But essentially, we'd gotten through all those basics of being able to create active record objects and work with them. So what I wanted to start with today was to just point out how these active record objects are going to kind of play into the rest of the Rails stack in a way, if we want to think of it that way. What role, how it is, I guess, that we're going to end up seeing them used the majority of the time. Right? So where we're typically going to be doing most of our work with active record objects is in the controller part of a Rails application. Right now, in this little active record example application that I've been playing with, the only controller that I have is called the application controller. It's sort of the default controller. Really not much of anything going on inside of it. So just to kind of demonstrate, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and create a controller for books, which is the type of active record object that we've been working with, and then just kind of run through and see where some of the different things we've been learning about active record objects are actually going to be used there in that controller. So I'm going to jump over to a console. I'm already in my project itself. I'm going to ask Rails to generate for me a new controller. The controller I want to generate, I want to be called Books Controller. So I'm going to put Books here. Right? And I'll just go ahead and hit Enter. I think that'll give me what I want. Yep, looks like it. Number of different files or directories were created for me. Right? Most importantly, the one that I really wanted is this file called Books Controller, which here is going to start off initially as being blank. Open up you. There we go. Right. So my Books Controller starts off blank, but it does inherit from Application Controller, as we talked about before. So anything in Application Controller would automatically become a part of Books Controller. Right. What we would generally see inside a controller, like Books Controller, is fundamentally 7 different methods, the 7 different RESTful actions, they sometimes call them. What we would end up with is we would end up with methods called index, show, new, create, edit, update, and destroy. Did I spell destroy right? Yeah, looks like I did. That's that one I always misspell, D-E-S-T-R-O-Y. I think I got it right this time. So anyway, in most controllers, when we're basically setting up kind of a CRUD scenario where we need to be able to read, create, update, and delete different types of data collections, like books, for example, usually in Rails it would be set up so that those things would all happen using these 7 different actions. What each one of these actions would essentially be for, the index action is essentially a list. So in this case, we would expect for the index action to give us back a list of books. So the active record work that would go on inside the index method would essentially be retrieving from active record all of the books that we want to view. Right? So we know we can do that by just doing book.all. Right? So in the index action, typically the active record work would consist of calling books.all to retrieve all the books or some subset of books that we want to view if we're paginating them in some way. And then we would, excuse me, we would just take that list of books and we would put it into an instance variable, probably called books, which is what would then be available to us in our view. So we could iterate over that list of books and display them in the view in whatever way is appropriate. Right? In the show action, the general purpose of the show action is typically to show a single book. show details of a single book is about what show is usually used for. Right? What would happen in the show action is we would be provided by Rails, right, with a hash called params. There's an S there, isn't it? Yeah, it's params, plural. Right? And inside this params hash, they would have the ID of a particular book in it. Right? So essentially, when the show action was called, the show action would be passed the ID of the book that we're supposed to show. Right? That ID would be available to us here in this hash, a little bit of behind-the-scenes magic that Rails would do for us automatically. And then what we would essentially here inside the show action need to do is we would need to retrieve the book that has that particular ID. So as we learned, oh, it's a hash with a curly brace if you're putting a hash together. Okay. But when you're accessing a hash, you still use the square brace notation. Okay. Yeah, to access the value of a particular key. So anyway, yeah, we could say book.find and then pass it that particular ID from what we've been doing in the console the last few class periods. We know that that would retrieve one individual book for us, the book that has that actual ID. We could take that individual book, we could put it into an instance variable, which then again would become available to us over in our view, so that we would then be able to go through the attributes of that book and splice them into the view, so the user at the other end of the request, the user in their web browser, would be able to see the details of that one book. Right? So that's basically the way that typically goes. Sound okay? All right. The new action. The new action is one that would be called whenever the user has somehow requested that they want to create a new book. Right? When they want to create a new book, if you think about it from a web application point of view, essentially what we want the user to have is a form that they'll be able to fill out. But that form needs to have an actual object in which, an actual object to reference, I guess we could say, so that it knows what the different attributes of the book are, it knows what validations have to be performed, those sorts of things. So for new, basically what we would want to do is we'd want to provide the user with a new, empty, blank book. Right? And again, from the active record we've been doing lately, we know that we could just do book.new in order to create a new book that has no actual values stored in it. So we could take that new empty book, we could put it into a book instance variable, which is what would then be available in the view. Okay. Whenever the user actually does take that new empty book and provide data for it by filling out a web form, right, when they actually submit that web form, what would happen is at that point it would call the create action. Right? So the create action's job is to basically take the form filled in details of a book and actually turn it into a real book object and save it to the database. Right? So let's see, how do I summarize that here? Create, use submitted book data to make a book. Right? So what would generally go on inside the create action, right, is we would want to, again, take params that had been submitted, right? Kind of like we had the params up in the show action, which is where we would get the ID of the book that was supposed to be shown. Here, inside create, the params would be all of the data that was submitted from the form, and all the data in the form would be inside that params hash under the key of book. What book inside the params hash here actually would be another hash, sort of a sub-hash inside the params hash. Right? And what we could do with that then is we could call book.new and we could pass it that sub-hash, that book hash inside params. Right? And as we saw when we were working in the console, the new method of our active record objects have the ability to take data to fill the object with in the form of a hash. So we can take the data that was submitted from the form, we can pass it straight to book.new, and that will create a new book for us. So I could take that new book that's created, put it into an instance variable. And at that point, we have a new book that is not yet saved. Right? So what I would want to do with it next then is I would want to actually try to save the book. Book.save. Right? Now, up to this point, we've never had a save fail. Right? Save has always worked. It's always returned true. But as soon as we're done talking about this little subject, the next thing we're going to get into are validations. And at that point, we'll start running into situations where our active record objects won't always save. They will only be allowed to save to the database if they pass validation. Right? So thinking ahead to that point, what we would typically do inside the create action of a controller is we would say if we're able to save, right? And then we would specify what to do if the save is successful and what to do if the save is not successful. Right? If the save actually is successful, then typically what we would do is we would redirect the user using a method that will be available to us in our controllers called redirect to. Right? And usually where we would redirect them is to the show page. And here we'll find out later that there's a nice little trick with redirect to, where if we simply give it an object, it'll automatically understand that that means go to its show page. Okay. We also would probably want to be able to provide the user with a little bit of feedback, let them know that their book actually was saved. Right? The redirect to method, which we'll talk about a whole lot more later, also has that aspect of it covered, where we could pass a second argument, call it notice, right? A hash key called notice, where we could tell the user the book was created or something like that. If we try to save the book and saving the book fails, then just like in any other web application, if something goes wrong with validation, probably what we want to do is we want to show the user the form again. Put them right back at the form, show them error messages embedded in the form so they can correct whatever went wrong with validation and then try to submit the data again. Right? So here what we would do is we would ask Active Record to render for us the new action again. Do it this way. Okay. Obviously we haven't covered the redirect to part, the render part, not especially. Okay. But as far as the active record bits go, right, creating a new book would basically be taking the values that were submitted from the form, which will be here in a hash called params for us, right, using that to make a new book, and then trying to save the book. The save will succeed or fail, and then we do these other things based on whether the book is properly saved or not. Okay. The next action then, edit, right? Allows a user to edit a book. Okay. Now editing, if you think back to other things that you might have done like in PHP for example, editing is often very similar to new. Right? When we did new, basically what we wanted to do is show the user just a blank form, an empty form that they could complete to create the new book. Right? With editing, we very often can show them pretty much the exact same form. The difference is, in this case, the book or the form would need to already be filled with the details of the book that they're supposed to edit. So the way the edit action in a controller is typically set up is it's again going to be provided with the ID of the book that we want to edit, and we'll end up being able to access that ID again through that params hash. Right? That params hash comes in handy all over the place in controllers. Right? So what we'd want to do is we'd want to retrieve the book. So we could just do a book.find for that particular ID. Right? That book then being available, okay, using some helpers that we'll learn about later, will automatically have its details filled into the edit form. So the user will see a form pop up and it'll be full of the details of this one individual book that we happen to retrieve for them. The update action is what would then be called when the user submits the edit form. Okay. Use submitted edited book data to update book is basically what the update action is meant to do. Okay. This ends up looking a whole lot like the create action. What we would do here is we would again retrieve the book. So book.find, like we've been doing. We would have the ID of the book that we want to retrieve. We would then want to actually update the book. So like we saw last week, we can call update attributes. and we can pass it the params hash that contains the form data. So the form data for the book would be passed to update attributes, and you remember it took its arguments in the form of a hash, which makes it real easy here in the controller because we can just take the hash from inside params and pass it straight to update attributes. Okay. The other things that happen inside the update method are not so much related to active record, but like up in the create action, we would want to check to see if the update was allowed to happen. Right. The update might fail if some of the updates invalidate the book, don't pass validation. So again, it would be then a matter of telling the controller what it is we want to happen if the update succeeds or if the update fails. If the update actually succeeds, then kind of like we did before, we probably want to show the user the updated book. So I would tell Rails to redirect the user to that individual book. Maybe I would display a notice. The book was updated. If the redirect fails, I'm sorry, not the redirect, if the update fails, then we want to show them the edit form so they can fix whatever problems they made, whatever problems they created. So I could tell Rails to again render the edit form. Okay. The edit form in this case would use this book that was retrieved at the beginning of the update action in order to populate the form. So basically the unsaved, partially updated version of the book, not reverting back to the original book itself. Right. Down under destroy, whenever the web user says that they want to destroy a book, they would have to provide the ID of the book, which of course would probably just mean they click on a hyperlink, not even realizing that there's actually an ID there. We would make sure of that. Okay. Under destroy, what we would then do is we would retrieve the book, so book.find, based on the ID that was passed to the action, and then we would do just simply book.destroy. There's destroy, I always do that. Twice in a row this time. Destroy. I think I finally got it. That would then wipe out the book whose ID was passed to the destroy action, and that was made available to the destroy action. All right. The only other thing we would need to do inside the destroy action then would be to, after the book is actually destroyed, redirect the user someplace else. So I might send them to the books URL, which would basically put them back at the list page, the index page.
Is that books URL like something built in? Is that something just type in?
It's something that's automatically generated for us. It's a method that'll automatically be created for us by the router.
Couldn't you still do render action index?
Possibly, but we would have to retrieve a list of all the books first because the index action requires an array of books to show. So if we retrieve the array of books, we could then render action index. Yeah, could do that. All right. So this is more or less the way that Rails controllers typically end up looking. Right? More often than not, they will have these 7 actions in them. When they do have these actions, these are almost always what the actions are meant to do. Right? So index to list multiple books, show to show an individual book, new to provide a new form, create, right, which is where the new form submits to that actually saves a book, edit, which shows an edit form, update, which is where edit submits to and updates the book, and destroy, which wipes out a book. Right? That's pretty much always what those 7 actions are going to do. And you can see bits and pieces in here, or actually not even really bits and pieces. I would even say kind of the majority of what goes on here inside a controller is just the exact same sort of thing that we have been doing in the console when we were playing with Active Record. Doing things like retrieving all books, retrieving specific books with book.find, creating new books with book.new. We do that in a couple of places. Saving books with book.save. Right? Updating books with update attributes that we talked about last week. Destroying books, another one from last week. So all that stuff that we've been doing in the console aren't things that we will always be doing in the console. Eventually, those will all become things that get built into the controller. So when the user does things like fill out forms or click on hyperlinks and these different actions execute, as a result of the user submitting a form or clicking on a hyperlink, we'll have these different active record actions, different active record behaviors that will end up taking place. So that's more or less where we'll end up seeing most of our active record work in the long run. Most of it will be right around here in the controller. Make any sense whatsoever? Okay. Now, in my update and my create actions that I wrote here, in both of them I call save. Well, I'm sorry. In create I call save for a book. In update I call update attributes. Both of those two cases I set that up as a condition for an if statement, right? Because there's the possibility with either one of those that it may return true or it may return false. Right? Update attributes and save will both return true if the data can be saved or can be updated. They'll both return false if the data can't be saved or can't be updated. Right? So like I was saying before, under what circumstances would we not be able to save a book or not be able to update a book? Well, if we've set up our book or any other active record object so that it validates the data that's put in, either one of those two methods, save or update attributes, may end up rejecting changes or rejecting a new book if that book does not satisfy any validations that we may have put into the object, into the model. So that's the next thing I wanted to go on and talk about, is how do we validate? How do we include validations? If I jump back over to my console, if I start up my if I jump back over to my terminal, I guess I should say, and I start up the Rails console, Rails C, right? What happens right now, if I do book.all, is I can see all the books that I currently have. If I say book.create, which both makes a new book and saves it, but I don't even provide any data, right, it goes ahead and does it. Right? If I look at book.all now, you can see I have a blank book in there, which is obviously not something that is probably very desirable in most situations. I guess we could dream up some scenario where, yeah, it's okay to have a blank object of some sort stored in our database, a blank record. But most of the time, there are going to be probably some constraints that we want to put on what is allowed and what is not allowed in our data that we are collecting and making use of. Right? And at the moment, obviously, no attention is being paid to that whatsoever. It'll take anything, right? Just about any value I can put in or leave out for that matter, it will just go ahead and say, fine, I'll take it, and it'll save it to the database that way. Right? So what we need to do is validations. What we need to do is we need to teach our active record objects, right, how to protect themselves, right, how to make sure that the data that's important to that particular object cannot be set to values that are not considered to be good, not considered to be valid or legitimate in some ways. Right? To do this, we're going to have to write pages and pages and pages of code. Right? Lots of if statements, and I'm just kidding. We don't have to do any of that. Rails Active Record makes it fairly ridiculously easy to do most of the most common types of validations. Right? When we want to do validations on an active record object, where we're actually going to put those validations is into the model file. So in this case, into the book.rb file under the models directory. Same place last week where we were creating class and instance methods to make it more convenient for us to be able to work with some of the data that deals with that model. Okay? When we want to do validations, the way most validations end up being done is by calling the validates method. Validates method is one that's automatically provided for us. Right? We just have to call it. When we call the validates method, we need to tell it what it is that we're actually wanting to validate. So I could say, for example, that I want to validate the title. Right? If I wanted to, I could also say I want to validate the author. I could list out a validates call for every different field that I want to perform a validation on. Okay. I could also, however, chain them together. So I could do a single validates call and I could say I want to validate the title and the author, just comma separate them. Okay. So I could say I want to validate the title, the author, the ISBN, the page count, the publisher, right? Something like that. Put as many of the different attributes of the model in there as I happen to want to. Okay. Tell it to validate all 5 of those. The only other thing I have to do then, when I call the validates method, is I have to tell it what kind of validation it is that I want. Right? There are a lot of very standard validation types that are built in to ActiveRecord. To be honest, it's actually not ActiveRecord anymore at that point. It's a separate class, ActiveModel, right? But closely related, and it's all available to us one way or another. Right? So there are a lot of very common validation types automatically built in. We basically just have to say which one or which of them we actually want. Okay? So let's say the simplest form of validation, just making sure that something isn't blank, right? Validating the presence of something. Essentially, we don't want a book to be able to be created that doesn't have a title, an author, an ISBN, a page count, or a publisher. All those values we've decided have to be there. Okay? We could do that simply by saying presence is true. So essentially that statement ends up becoming that this class validates title, author, ISBN, page count, publisher for presence, meaning they are not allowed to be blank. That was rough, wasn't it? Didn't have to write any loops, didn't have to write any if statements or regular expressions. That ought to basically do the trick all by itself. If I jump back over to my console, I'm going to call reload so that it'll recognize the changes I just put into my model. If I try to create a new book now, if I say b equals book.new, so I've got a blank book in memory. If I then try to save that book, for the first time, look what it did. Gave us back false. Okay. Before, when I tried that, before we put in the validation, it accepted it and went ahead and saved it to the database. But now, because of the presence of that validation, the presence of the presence validation, maybe I could say if I wanted to be especially confusing, okay? Because of the validation we added to our model, now it won't just blindly accept an empty book the way it was before. Now when we try to save it, it automatically runs that validation on the new book that's being saved. When it sees that it fails the validation, it refuses to save it and returns false. If I go look at book.all, the only blank book in there is the one that I created before the validation. There's not a second blank book. So definitely, the book I just tried to create, B, was not saved. Okay? That could potentially be really frustrating. If we create an object, we put some data into it, we call save, and it just says false, how are we supposed to know what actually went wrong? How are we supposed to know why it didn't actually save? Well, it turns out that all of the details about what went wrong during validation all got stored back in the object itself. Inside the object B, right, there's now an attribute in there called errors. It's actually an object that's stored there in the errors attribute of the book. You can see it's an ActiveModel errors object. Inside that object, there's an attribute called base. Inside base, they have a copy of the book itself. Right? So we can see all the different values in it that we tried to save. It also, you'll notice in there, has an attribute called messages. First thing on about the third line in my display. Inside messages is where it actually puts in the more verbose English explanations about exactly what went wrong. So there's a number of things that I could potentially do here. If I said b.errors.size, it comes back and tells me how many errors I have. There were 5 problems here that kept this book from being saved. Right? And if we look at the object, how many different fields did I say can't be blank? 5. Title, author, ISBN, page count, and publisher. So that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Right? If I say b.errors and I give it a specific field name, like if I say show me the errors for title, it comes back and says the error is can't be blank. If I say show me the error for publisher, can't be blank. Now obviously all we're checking for right now is presence, but as we start introducing other types of validations besides just can't be blank, we'll see these error messages change depending on exactly what it is that went wrong. There may also be times when we see multiple error messages for a single field. Like, for example, with page count. Maybe we say that page count has to be a positive number and it can't be blank. We could do 2 validations on it. If we tried to submit a blank page count then, we would see 2 error messages. It can't be blank and the value is not greater than 0. So all the error messages, all the details about the errors, all stored right there for us. Which is great, because that means that when we get into the web view part of all of this, we'll be able to take all those error messages and be able to pop them right into the form itself. We'll be able to use the actual keys from that errors array to highlight fields that have problems. Basically all the details we need for communicating back to the user what went wrong when they tried to create a new book are all right there inside that book object itself. Right? So it'll be pretty easy for us to take those details and actually make something useful and user-friendly out of them. Right? I think I might want to digress here for just one second. Right? The display of the errors that I did up there when I said b.errors, if you look at it, stare at it hard enough, you can kind of see what it is, what it looks like. But I think we could probably modify our console just a little bit to make that a little bit more visible to us, a little bit easier to see. Okay. I'm going to jump out of console here for a minute. And what I want to do is in my project, I'm going to go over to my gem file. Okay. And in my gem file in the development group, I'm going to ask it to install a gem for me called AwesomePrint. Nice little gem. With that added to my gem file, back over in the terminal, if I run bundle, the bundle command, oh, I don't have a connection to the network.
Is it called AwesomePrint?
Yep, AwesomePrint, awesome_print. Let me start that bundle again. There you go. You can see in here it installed AwesomePrint for me. Should be available throughout the project. Okay. If I go back into my console, right, if I require AP, the AwesomePrint gem, right, that AwesomePrint gem then can help clean up some of that output, make it a little bit prettier, a little bit easier to see. Right? The easiest way to actually use it, though, is not to go straight into the console and require it, but instead to integrate it into our .irbrc file. Right? So basically what I might do, oh yeah, let me grab my cheat sheet. The code to get AwesomePrint to work nicely and conveniently with console, I never remember off the top of my head, so I printed out a copy of my IRBRC file so I could just copy it in. I'm going to go ahead and open my IRBRC file. There's what I have in it right now, basically just the code we put in to enable HIRB. If I also wanted to enable awesome print, let me do, let's say begin, let me try to require AP like I just did manually in the console. Okay. But then assuming that we actually can require it, what I'm going to do is in the IRB module, there's an IRB class, which I believe is capital I, little r, little b. Okay. Then I'm going to do a class eval. Okay. Basically in here we then want to override a method. It uses a method called output value, which is how it actually displays the output in the console, or in the console in IRB itself. And what I'm going to do here is instead of having it just display it the way it normally does, which is more or less with inspect, I'm going to tell it to display with awesome print. That's what the AP is right there. So it's context dot last value. So essentially just kind of going in and changing the way that IRB displays the output from objects you type. You know, in IRB in the console, every time we type an expression, it comes back and shows us the value, usually with inspect. Here, we're saying instead of using inspect, use awesome print instead. In the rescue, we're going to rescue from load errors. And if we get a load error, I'll just say AP gem not found. Install gem awesome print. There. That way, if awesome print isn't installed, it won't crash our console every time we try and start it up. We'll just see that error message and then go on and use it anyway. Okay.
Once we do gem install awesome print, will automatically be all of our Rails projects?
It'll be not all of your Rails projects, the current Rails project. Yeah, when you put something into a gem file, that makes that gem available to that project that has that gem file. If you start a new project, you'll have to put it in that project's gem file as well. It may already be installed, so it won't have to install it again, but in order for it to be recognized, in order for it to be used, it has to be in the gem file. Alright, let me start my console up again. Good, no error messages. Okay. So if I try and make a new book, I don't provide any data for it, and I try and save it. You see awesome print already doing its work? The false showed up as red, whereas before it was just gray. If I go to book.errors, oh, it actually didn't help. What if I look at errors title? There, it helped a little bit there. Lets me know that element 0 of the array that we actually have there has the string in it, can't be blank. It didn't help as much as I hoped it would, but it does still help some. It's nice to have. Okay? Alright, so anyway, with that in place, back to the actual validations. Okay? We've already put in a validation now. There we go. Basically saying that title, author, ISBN, page count, and publisher's presence has to be true. They can't be blank, essentially. I don't like that. I need to turn wrapping off. Okay. There's a few other things that we can do with validates. Okay? I mean, just sort of in general. A few other general options that can be done with the validates method. Right? There are certainly other types of validations. We'll get to those in a second. But just validates itself, a few other things we can do with it. Right? One of the others is that if we don't like the message it provides, like that can't be blank, if we wanted to customize that message that's returned, we have the ability to do that. Essentially what we would do is instead of doing presence true like this, we could instead say presence and then provide a hash. Inside that hash, we could say that presence is true. We could also then put in a message attribute. And I could say something like must have some content. Kind of changing the style of that line a little bit. Before we just simply said presence is true. Now we're saying presence, and then for options, is true and has this message. And I don't know why I'm writing that as an old style hash. Is true, message is that. So before, whenever I left one of those fields blank, it came back and gave me the message can't be blank. If I reload my console, reload exclamation point, let me try to make a book again, a blank book. So b equals book.new. If I say b.save, I get false. And if I then go look at the errors for the title of the book, instead of saying can't be blank, it now says must have some content. So it's using the custom error message that I put in for the presence validator. So you can customize those error messages, make them say whatever it is that you happen to want. This works with the presence validator. This will also work with any of the other types of validations that we talk about. Okay. Some other options that are going to be available to us with all the different types of validations. With pretty much every validation we use, we'll be able to specify when the validation actually happens. By default, the validation always happens on save. Right? So anytime the model is saved, right, it will perform the validations. That means the validation happens when it's a new model object that's being created, or if it's an existing model that's being updated. Right? It'll run our validations in either case. If we want to, what we could do is we could specify on, and then we could, for example, say create. What that would do is that would basically tell this particular validation, the validation for presence, that it should only run when this is a new object that is being created. That would then mean that this validation would not execute whenever the object is being updated. So if we went back and updated a book right now, took out a title and left the title blank, right, it wouldn't check the title again when it did the update. Okay. Instead of doing on create, we could do on update instead, which would be just sort of the opposite. That means the validation wouldn't be checked when it's a new object being created. It would only be checked when it's an existing object that's being updated. So we can make that distinction if we ever happen to need to with any of the different types of validations we're going to put in. In this case, I don't want it at all, so I'm just going to wipe it back out. Trying to think, what else is there that's general? That might be about it, right? So with any of our different types of validations, we can always specify a custom message. We can always specify when the validation is going to happen. On save is the default. So the only other thing we'd have to talk about with validations then is what other kinds of validations can Rails do automatically? Can ActiveRecord or ActiveModel do automatically? And what types of validations are we still going to be responsible for writing ourselves? Okay. So anyway, we've got this one. We can validate that something can't be blank. Just looking to make sure I didn't skip anything. All right, we can validate the length is another custom or another built-in validation type. So I could, for example, say validates the Isbn, and we could say we check that the length. Okay. We could say that the length is 10, for example. With that one in place, if I reload my console, try to create a new book, try to save that book, that should have run the validation. If I then go look at the errors in the object for the ISBN number, there are two error messages there. One of them says must have some content. That's the message that was generated because I said that the ISBN can't be blank, validating its presence. And the second error message that's now there says is the wrong length, should be 10 characters. That is being created by this new length validation. If I said that it had to be 13 characters, we're having class right now. If I change it to the length is 13 characters, reload the console, try to make a new book that doesn't meet the requirements, doesn't meet the validations, try and save that book and take a look at the errors for ISBN. Now there's a message in there that says it's the wrong length, should be 13 characters. Pretty smart, isn't it? And boy, is that an easy little validation to do.
It can't be no more or less on the number.
There are a lot of other options you can put in here. Instead of doing is, which always checks for an exact length, right? There are also options you can put in for minimum, maximum, or within. Right? So we could use any combination of those potentially. I guess is and within probably would have to kind of fly solo. Those would have to go by themselves. But there's minimum and maximum options that you could use together.
Just max.
They're actually minimum and maximum, the whole word spelled out. Yeah. We could give it a try. We could say minimum is 10. Maximum is 13. Again, reload, make a new book, try to save the new book, and if I look at the errors, it says it's too short. The minimum is 10. Well, if I take my new book and I set the ISBN to that, and then I try to save the book, and I look at the errors, now it says is too long. Maximum is 13. So it's recognizing when it's below the minimum, when it's above the maximum. It gives me appropriate error messages in both situations. Pretty neat.
And this within just that, it's just the word within.
Yeah, with within, instead of minimum and maximum, we would say within. Oh. And then what we could do is we could give it a range. So within the range of 10 to 13. Reload. Book.new. Save. B. Errors for ISBN. Right. So again, it's saying it's too short. If I put a big number in there that goes over the 13, the error message will change to too long. Essentially, within is the same kind of thing as that doing the minimum and maximum. It's just a more concise way of writing it, providing it with a range. Any of those will work. Right. We can also still do things like provide a custom error message. Right. We could put in message just like we did with the presence validation. So,
Is that you get a presence validation too?
yeah, the way we specified the custom message up here, this guy, you can do that with length as well. So we could put a message in here if we wanted to. Okay. So there's a second type of built-in validation we can use. Third type. Let's say we want to validate page count. And what we could validate here is the numericality of the page count. Basically making sure that the page count is actually a number of some type. Is that a made-up word, numericality? I hope it is. I love it. What a great word. Yeah. I try to slip it into conversation whenever I can. Numericality. I hope I spelled it right. When you're validating numericality, there's a number of different things you can do. First of all, if you want to require that it actually is a number, you can put is true as an option for it. So it's required that its numericality be true. I suppose it's also possible that you could validate the numericality of something and say is false to make sure that something is not a number. If you wanted to make sure somebody didn't put in the number 15 as their first name or something like that, potentially. Right. With numericality, we can also check to make sure a value is an integer versus a real number with a decimal point in it. So for page count, that would be appropriate. Typically with books, they don't measure fractional pages. So we could say that we only allow integers, only integer is true. So it has to be true. It has to be a number. It can only be an integer, so no floating point numbers would be allowed. We can also check for if it's greater than a particular value, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. It'll even let us make sure that a number is odd or even if we happen to want to. Hard to think of situations where that would be terribly important, but I do believe the options are there. So for page count, we could say that the page count has to be greater than 0. And maybe just as a sanity check, we could say it has to be less than or equal to 10 million. There's, of course, not any real reason that I would want to do the equal to on that. I just wanted to put it in as the example. So a handful of options there when we're checking the numericality of page count. It does have to be numerical. It does have to be an integer. It has to be greater than 0, so no negative numbers. And I've said it has to be less than or equal to 10 million. You have to put your foot down somewhere. We simply will not allow books that have more than 10 million pages. All right, let's give it a try, see what we get. Reload my console, new book. That's not how you spell new, it turns out. There we go. Try to save the book. There are, of course, errors, so the book doesn't save. If I look at the errors for page count, right, I get the validation error, the presence error, I guess I should say, saying it must have some content, and now I'm also getting an error saying it's not a number. Right? That's the requiring the numericality. It recognizes that it's not a number and is flagging that. In B, if I set the page count to 1.2, try to save the book, take a look at the errors for page count. It says it must be an integer. It noticed that it's not blank anymore, so must have some content has gone away. If I try to set the page count to a -8, resave the book, take a look at the errors. It says it must be greater than 0. If I try to set the page count to that many pages, save the book, look at the errors, has to be less than or equal to 10 million. Looks like it's getting it, right? How about if I try to set the page count to 99. Save the book. Look at the errors. Well, that number is perfectly valid based on the validations that we've put in. So no errors for page count in this book at that point. Good? All right. Numericality. How are we doing? Do you have questions so far? The next one, the next type of validation is what I call the Highlander validation. To ensure there can be only one. Right? Validating for uniqueness. Are ISBN numbers unique? Truly unique?
I think for one title, not for one book in particular.
Okay.
Like a book for episode 4 wouldn't have the same ISBN for episode 3.
Right.
Every episode 4 book would have the same ISBN. Because that's how we search for books in the TCC.
Right. Multiple copies of the same book, of course, have the same ISBN. So if we've got 20 copies of one given Ruby book, they would all have the same ISBN. But would any other book in the world be allowed to have the same ISBN as that Ruby book?
No.
Okay, so on a greater scale, ISBNs would have to be unique. Okay, so I was thinking what we could do is we could add a validation that checks the uniqueness of ISBNs, right? We would have to assume here that in our database with our books, we're not talking about individual books. We're just talking about titles, basically. So maybe in our database, we would say for this book, there are 40 of them in stock, right? But all 40 of those would have the same ISBN, but no other book could have the same ISBN as that particular title did, right? So anyway, there can be only one. Right. Validates. Let's validate the ISBN. And if we want to make sure that we cannot have multiple books that have the same ISBN, then what we can do is we can specify uniqueness as what we want to validate. Something like that. Make sure that the ISBN's uniqueness is true. Let's see if that works. Let me reload my console. What ISBNs do I already have? Yeah, they look like they're a mess. Let's change one of those ISBNs to be a little bit more manageable. Let me just grab one of my books. Let me grab book 1. I'll do book.find ID of 1. If I look at that book's ISBN number, that's what it is, which I don't want to mess with trying to duplicate to test for uniqueness. So let me set that book's ISBN to 111. And then I'm going to resave that book. Oh, and I got caught by one of my own validations. It wouldn't save. Yeah. Why wouldn't it save? Looks like I see a message about the ISBN and there being too short. I specified it had to be 10 characters minimum. All right, so instead of 111, let me set the ISBN to 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That'll be easy enough for me to remember. Can I save the book now? Yeah, now it's saved. True. Okay, so now that I have a book with a known ISBN, 0 through 9, if I try to create another new book, and when I create this new book, I try and give it an ISBN of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's my new book with that ISBN that I just put in. If I try to save that book, it doesn't save. I get the false back. If I go to look at the errors for the ISBN number, it tells me has already been taken. So it recognized that there was already a book in the database with that particular ISBN, and refused to save my new book. If you actually look at the SQL that was executed there, it went out and it selected from books where a book had an ISBN of the same book that I was trying to create. Right? What's basically going to happen now with this uniqueness check is anytime I save a book, the first thing Active Record's going to do is it's going to go out, search the database to see if there's already a book with that ISBN. If it doesn't find one, it'll recognize that and pass this validation. Maybe not necessarily save the book, there could be other things wrong with it, but at least let it pass the uniqueness validation. Okay? Whereas if, in this case, it finds a book that already has that same ISBN, it doesn't take another step, doesn't go on and save. Okay? It's pretty smart, isn't it? With uniqueness, we can specify whether case sensitivity should be taken into account, whether we want it to be case sensitive or not, if capitalization matters or not. We can also specify whether blanks are allowed. So if we have a field that's sort of optional, where maybe the user doesn't provide anything, but if they do provide something, it has to be unique, then we could set an option for the uniqueness validation saying allow blank true. Right? That means if it's blank, fine, don't worry about it. Just let it be blank even if there's others that are already blank. Blanks don't have to be unique. Okay? But if it's not blank, then check to make sure there isn't another one that already has that same value. Another trick with uniqueness is that sometimes things are unique but only on a limited scale, within a limited scope, would be a better way probably of saying that. Like with our books, we could say, for example, that titles have to be unique, but only for a given publisher. Right? Publisher 1 could have a book that has the same title as Publisher 2, right? But Publisher 1 should not offer two separate distinct books with the same title. We could say that's our scenario. Right? For that kind of situation, what we could do is to our uniqueness, for our uniqueness validation, we could use the scope option. We could say that the uniqueness is scoped to, oh, I shouldn't be doing this for ISBN. Hold on a second. There we go. Let me say validates title for uniqueness. Right? I'm going to say uniqueness is true, but that we're going to put it within the scope of the publisher. So that would then mean that one publisher can't have two books with the same title, but two different publishers can have two books with the same title. Now, let me give it a try. Let's see. What books do we have? Book number 4 there. What's book 4's title? Learning SQL the Hard Way. Right? So book number 4 that's already in the database has a title of Learning SQL the Hard Way, and it has a publisher of Singer Publishing. Now, if I wanted to create a new book, this new book, I'm going to set its title to Learning SQL the Hard Way. And I'm going to set its publisher to Singer Publishing. If I try to save that book, we've got problems. If I look at the errors for the title, says we have none. For the publisher, oh, says we have none there either. So where are the errors? Is that it? Why didn't we get our uniqueness problem? Has already been taken. Looks like it's listing it for ISBN. But see the has already been taken? That was the one I was looking for. That's the output from our uniqueness check. And it looks like that's coming out on the ISBN. Did I reload my console? I can't remember if I did or not. This is saved. Let me try this again. Reload. All right. Let's make a new book. Title of Learning SQL the Hard Way. Publisher of Singer Publishing. Try to save it. If I look at the errors, author must have content, ISBN must have content, is too short, has already been taken. Page count must have content, is not a number. Title, there it is at the end, title has already been taken. I don't think I reloaded my console before, that's why it wasn't showing up. That's the one I was looking for. So this last validation I did, checking for uniqueness of the title, scoped on publisher. Right? So when I tried to create a second book with the same publisher with an existing title, a non-unique title, it looks like it is picking that up. If I try to set the publisher instead to something else, Apress, and then try to save that book, if I look at the title errors, it's gone. Now, even though in this case the title does exist, it only exists for a different publisher. So outside the scope of what we're checking on the uniqueness for. So there it's going to allow it. It's going to allow a book with a duplicate title to be created so long as it's by a different publisher. Yeah? Let's see. Got a lot more of these. How about one more? One more for today. Validating the format of something. Up here we validated the length of the ISBN number, making sure that it was within the range of 10 to 13. I'm going to comment that out. I want to validate the ISBN number in a better way. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want to validate the ISBN number, but instead of simply making sure that it's the proper number of digits, what I want to do is I actually want to be able to provide a regular expression to compare the value of the ISBN number against to make sure that it actually matches. Right? To do that, I can say that I'm validating for the ISBN its format. Right? With the format option of validates, I can provide a number of different sub-options. Primarily what I'd want to do is I'd want to give it a width, W-I-T-H option, and that's where I could then give it a regular expression. So I could do something like, say, from the beginning to the end. There it is. What I expect to find, let's say, would be a digit followed by a hyphen. Do I need to quote that hyphen? I will, just to be safe. Right? Followed by 3 more digits. Followed by another hyphen. followed by what, 5 more digits? And then another hyphen? And then let's say 1 more digit after that. So 1 digit hyphen, 3 digits hyphen, 5 digits hyphen, 1 digit is what I'm going to say is the pattern I want to see for the ISBN. Back over in the console, if I reload, go to make a new book, try to save the book, look at the errors for the ISBN number. Must have some content. It's already been taken because on the uniqueness we didn't tell it to allow blank. And now we also have a third message that says is invalid. That's what's coming from the format validation. Right? Is invalid. If I say b.isbn equals bunch of ones like that, b.save, look at the errors for the ISBN, it's still saying it's invalid. It's comparing it against the regular expression I provided, seeing that it doesn't match the proper pattern, and is declaring it as being invalid. Invalid format. Let's see if I make 1 number hyphen, 3 numbers hyphen, 5 numbers hyphen, and then 1 number. And then try to save it. And look at the errors. It matches the regular expression now, so it's no longer being declared invalid.
On the uniqueness of checking for blank, would you do blank true?
I think it's allow blank true. Let's see, that would be here. We would say uniqueness is true, and then I think the option is allow blank true. Let's see what that gives us. Reload. Book.new. The errors for the ISBN. Right? It allowed it to be blank. So it said, okay, fine. If it's blank, we won't check anything else. Yeah. So allow blank true. Okay. Validations we have left to talk about that we'll hit next week. Ensuring confirmation, ensuring user acceptance, inclusion or exclusion, and then we can talk about writing custom validators. So if there's some sort of validation that you want done that is not covered by all these basic types that ActiveModel automatically provides, we'll be able to create our very own validators that will do whatever it is we want them to. Sound like a plan? Can I answer any questions? All right. Well, great. Hope you all have a good weekend. I'll see you Tuesday.